Okay, thank you all so much. So we're now here for the Visualising Extractive Capitalism in the Caribbean session, which will be facilitated by Esther Xosei, with speakers Kehinde Andrews, Kojo, Koram, and Eleanor Shearer. Please welcome the panel.
Good morning, everyone. Hope you're all doing well. So I'm going to share a few comments and then we're going to have a nice, warm fireside chat. So I'm Esther Xosei, as has already been said. And just to set the context for this session, 400 years since the English ships landed in Barbados in 1625, what followed wasn't just extraction. It was theft of lands, the kidnapping and enslavement of African peoples and indigenous peoples, millions of them, the forced labor that generated the wealth that built British capitalism or European capitalism. The Caribbean became a lab for racial capitalism, where African and indigenous bodies were literally converted into financial instruments, where human beings were collateral for loans, where the torture and death of enslaved people produced the sugar, cotton, and tobacco that financed the Industrial Revolution. But here's what we also must understand. The Africans who were trafficked to the Caribbean didn't just resist. They brought with them sophisticated political imaginaries, governance systems, and visions for different futures. Just 50 years after the English landing, an enslaved man, an Akan man from Africa named Kofi, planned one of the earliest major rebellions in Barbados. This was not just an escape attempt, it was a plan to overthrow the system of slavery itself and establish a just society with himself as the Asantehene, or the ruler of Barbados. A traditional Akan stall was actually, created for him. Of course, the plot was betrayed. The rebellion was brutally suppressed. At least 17 Africans were executed, some burned alive, others beheaded, but the vision was real. That vision for an alternative Caribbean. It represented a different possibility for what the Caribbean could be. And here's why this matters for our discussion today. The Caribbean that we have, the colonial borders that remain, its current governance systems and structures, its economic structures, were shaped deliberately by colonizers for extraction. It was designed to prevent alternatives from emerging. So the wealth in Britain was built not just on the theft of resources, but on the violent destruction of alternative visions of how the Caribbean, and we can say the wider world, could organize itself. The dispossession in the Caribbean didn't end either. It evolved. We know that those governance systems stayed, the structures remained, the economic relationships of extraction continued through different mechanisms, structural adjustment, debt, offshore financing. So as we talk today about repair and regeneration, we need to ask some hard questions. Are we trying to fix structures that were designed for extraction, or are we prepared to imagine something fundamentally different? So I'm joined today by three brilliant contributors whose work we are going to hear about. Eleanor Shearer, who is visualizing extractive capitalism in the Caribbean, making visible how wealth flows and where it accumulates. Kojo has given us framework for understanding how systems of racial capitalism operate and how revolutionary transformation occurs as well. And Kehinde, who has also been part of mapping the imaginaries in the Caribbean and looking at the psychology of whiteness and how that manifests even within the economic systems. So we're going to hear a bit more from them about the work that they're doing. And so I'm going to come to you first, Eleanor. Your research at Commonwealth is creating visualizations of extractive capitalism in the Caribbean, maps, data, frameworks that show how wealth flows. Can you help us visualize what it is that you see? What becomes visible when you map these flows? What are the specific mechanisms through which extraction continues today? The legal structures and the instruments. So just help us visualize that.
Thanks so much, Esther. Is this microphone on? Can you all hear me? Perfect. So as you mentioned, this project that we're doing at Commonwealth is actually publishing later this week. It's going to be an interactive map and timeline of Barbados, which the historian and chair of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, Hilary Beckles, has called the birthplace of British slave society. And I think there are two things that the research, this, as you say, mapping and looking at the flows of wealth and from the early plantation economy right up to the present, two things that it really brings out when you visualize this story. The first is that it's very easy in modern Britain today to feel like this is something that happened very far away. You know, the Caribbean, despite being integrated into the British Empire for such a long time, these are now independent nation states, and there can be a bit of a sense of hands being washed of the things that happen in these places. And it was actually Kojo who pointed out to me that because the first English ships arrived in 1625, Barbados was integrated into the English crown, so it became constitutionally part of England in 1627. Because that's 80 years before the Act of Union, there is actually a longer constitutional relationship between England and Barbados than there is between England and Scotland. So the idea that this wouldn't have had some kind of influence on the way that British society and the British economy developed, when you look at it like that, it doesn't seem sustainable, that it could have had no impact. So the first thing I think by doing this mapping is you show the ways in which empire really created a world system where people and capital flowed between different places. So many of us may be familiar with the idea of the triangular trade, and I think it's really important not to lose sight of, I'm going to go on to talk about some of the economic impacts, but I want to start with the human cost of transatlantic enslavement, because I really think it's important, even though we go on to talk about the legal, the financial architectures, that human cost really can't be forgotten. And one of the bits of data that really stuck out as particularly harrowing to me in Barbados is that Codrington Plantation, you may have heard of the Codrington family. They endowed a big library and All Souls College in Oxford, but they were big plantation owners in Barbados. It was 43% of Africans who arrived on the Codrington Plantation in the 18th century were dead within 3 years. So that's what we talk about when we talk about the incalculable human cost of what happened. But on top of that human cost is this economic system where wealth is being generated in so many different parts of the world and extracted from Barbados. So whether that's the fact that in order to purchase slaves in enslaved people in West Africa, you have silk merchants in London sending goods over, you have textile manufacturers in Liverpool, you have all these different bits of the UK pulled into that system of trade, you have shipbuilders in Liverpool taking lumber from the surrounding northwest. All of that is kind of profit built off the back of this system. It also draws in the North American colonies because Barbados is growing predominantly sugarcane. There's no land given over to food. They're importing most of their food. They're importing most of their goods, again, to the benefit of North American colonies, white colonies, and the UK as well. And all of that's to say that this geography of production that it created was very deliberate in terms of saying, you in the Caribbean are responsible for growing primary products. You literally, by law, cannot even refine the sugar that you grow. That has to be sent to the UK, where the kind of highest value bits of the commodity chain are done to the greatest profit for Britain. And I think it's very obvious when you look at that mapping, that the kind of echoes of the system today, even though many parts of the Caribbean are no longer solely dependent on sugar, if you look at something like the tourist economy, you have, again, an economic system where the Caribbean is hugely dependent on external factors, on the kind of economic position and goodwill of European and American visitors to the Caribbean. You have huge dependence on foreign capital, cruise ships literally floating. You know, if you as a Caribbean island threaten to put up your port taxes to try and recoup a little bit of the cost of that industry, the cruise ship will just dock elsewhere. And so, and also the ecological damage that these systems do. You know, the average cruise ship is generating 20,000 gallons of wastewater each day. It's generating 4 plastic bottles per passenger. It's generating electrical waste. It's generating light bulbs and batteries. And every time a cruise ship anchors in the Caribbean, it destroys an area of coral roughly the size of American football fields, which might take 50 years to regenerate. All of this is to say is I think that idea of empire being a world system where geographies of production box the Caribbean into particular kinds of economic activity, and that's still very much with us today. But the second thing I'll say is that it's also about emphasizing this isn't something that happened long ago. I think the story that we tell in Britain about transatlantic enslavement and the fact that, you know, certainly I learned in school, slavery was really bad. And then white people like William Wilberforce realized it was bad and they gave enslaved people their freedom, and that was it. You know, it ended in 1834 with the Emancipation Act, and that's the end of the story. And first of all, I think it was great, Esther, you mentioned the kind of deep history of enslaved resistance. So the fact that actually black people in the Caribbean were the agents of their own liberation. It wasn't a case of white abolitionists just coming along and giving them their freedom. But the second thing is that this isn't a story that ends in 1834. First of all, it's not, because the Emancipation Act actually says, well, by law, it was meant to be 6 years, ended up being 4 because of that resistance. But you have to work for 45 hours a week with no pay for your former masters. You know, I think it's becoming more widely known in the UK about the compensation that was paid to slave owners rather than the enslaved at emancipation. And that was a huge kind of transfer of wealth to slave owners as well. But then there was almost this second form of compensation in the fact that enslaved people had to keep working for free. And in Barbados, infant mortality actually went up in this period because the Emancipation Act freed all children under the age of 6. So suddenly planters said, well, they're not our responsibility anymore. So you have parents working for no pay for their former masters and unable to feed their children, so those children are dying. And then in so much of the Caribbean, especially in Barbados, the plantation system endures, and Barbados, it's something like 81% of the land is held by sugar planters. So there's no opportunity economically for people to do anything other than keep working on the plantations. And so this really, you can really see the kind of continuity through the 19th into the 20th century of the conditions that people were living in. And I'll just close by saying that my grandfather, he was born in Barbados in 1930, and it's in 1937 that after this massive labour unrest in the Caribbean, Britain sends this royal commission to investigate labour conditions. And what they find in terms of housing, health, sanitation, starvation level wages is so bad that the findings of this commission aren't published until 1945 because the British government are worried about giving propaganda to the Nazis. And my granddad, that's his childhood. So this is so close to the present day that I think it's really important when you sort of show that timeline of how the story doesn't end in 1834. That's the other thing I think that really comes to light. So it's not far away and it's not long ago. It's very much part of the British story and it's very much living history.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So I'm now going to come to you, Kojo. You've mapped the legal and financial architecture of extraction. You show how offshore structures, tax havens, corporate legal forms enable wealth to be drained from the Caribbean while maintaining apparent legality. So in showing us how this architecture has been built, can you say a bit more about that and its implications for all of us here today?
Absolutely. So thanks for both Esther, Kehinde, Eleanor for being in conversation with me today. And I think just continuing on from what Eleanor mapped out of the way in which the British Empire was established to facilitate wealth extraction all across the globe from a period that even precedes Britain, you know, with the fact that it has a longer constitutional relationship with Barbados, Jamaica. By the time we get the Act of the Union, Britain already has, you know, the Virginia slave colonies in what is now the modern day USA. It already has slave forts in Ghana and off the coast of Guinea. And so Britain is born as an imperial form. You know, we often say Britain had an empire, but if you look at the origin of the United Kingdom, if you even look at the motivations for the Scottish nobles signing the Act of the Union, and you know, the work of canonical Scottish writers like Robert Burns make this very clear, Robert Burns says, you sold out the Scottish state for English gold. You were tempted to join the English colonial project because Scotland's own imperial project in what was then New Caledonia, Panama falls apart, and then they draw into the riches that is emerging in the kind of post-Elizabethan moment. The empire really produces Britain, and that's what I think is important to remember. We often say that Britain had an empire. I think it's more accurate to say that the empire had Britain. It created so many of the institutions and structures of modern Britain, and you can read this in the discipline that I focus on, for my sins, don't judge me as a lawyer, but the trace of empire runs through the laws that continue to govern our political, our social, and particularly our economic system. And I think that's something that got missed a little bit over the last few years when Britain suddenly had a kind of a reckoning with its imperial history, for the first time, since the kind of conclusion of empire in the middle of the 20th century. We suddenly remembered that we once had an empire for 400 years that was the largest in human history, and we are having debates on Good Morning Britain and on the front of our newspapers about Britain's imperial history, and it was provoked, I think, by the fantastic kind of popular response to the Black Lives Matter movement, which clearly showed that there was a need for that imperial conversation to be had in Britain. We had the pulling down of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol, and then the discussion about statues in our public squares, what are our streets called? But I think there was a real effort by the mainstream media to almost trivialize that conversation by pushing it to further and further, more kind of culture war debates. And so we started off talking about statues and then street names, and then what kind of books are on our curriculum. And then at one point, the kind of debate around decolonization, I don't know if people remember, but was, should you be allowed to watch Fawlty Towers and other old kind of sitcoms on the BBC? That was like headline news for a week, And, what I wanted to kind of make clear at the time is, whilst the culture and symbolic sphere is important, the driver of empire wasn't cultural and symbolic. It wasn't about what songs do we sing at the last night of the proms, or what sitcoms do we watch, or what books do we read. In the book that I wrote on Commonwealth, I put a line in where I say, nobody got on a ship in the 18th century to sail across the Atlantic and give people a copy of Persuasion. Like, that is not what the driver of empire was. The driver of empire was the extraction and transfer of wealth over vast array of the globe, over a quarter of the globe by the time the British Empire falls. And many of the vehicles, many of the laws, many of the financial and legal architecture that facilitates that transfer of wealth continues to drive wealth inequality even deep into the 21st century. So I'll give a couple of concrete examples to make this clear. Over the last few years, there's suddenly been a re-emergence of debate around non-dom tax status. The fact that the UK has this quite unique, idiosyncratic tax status that allows people to be able to not be taxed on the wealth that they accrue in, outside of the jurisdiction, as a kind of non-resident within the United Kingdom. But there was very little in that conversation that talked about how the generative roots of the non-dom tax rule lie in empire. They lie in the ability to, or the driver of encouraging people following William Pitt the Younger's 1799 income tax imposition to encourage people to go into the colonies in order to establish private companies, in order to establish industry, and tell them that the money that you make in the colonies, you want to be taxed on back here in the United Kingdom. We can look at so many of the companies that continue to dominate the global sphere even deep into the 21st century. One of the things as well that was quite distinctive about the British Empire vis-a-vis some of the other European empires is that so much of the heavy lifting of British imperialism wasn't done by the state, but was done by quote-unquote private companies. Whether we think about the Muscovy Company and Levant Company very early on, or the Hudson Bay Company that colonized North America, or the Royal Niger Company that pretty much designed the borders of modern-day Nigeria, or the corporation that historians still think is probably the largest, most dominant private corporation that's ever existed, the British East India Company. Google and Facebook have nothing on them still. And when we talk about this kind of cultural argument of empire, that, well, empire was about civilizing the natives, it was about spreading literature, it was about spreading Christianity, it was about spreading kind of, English values around the world. Well, with those companies, we can actually look at their charters. We can look at what their motivations were. The East India Company, the Hudson Bay Company, the Royal Africa Company, that Colston was the director of. And you can, when reading their actual charters, you can see very clearly the motivation for these companies was the extraction and transfer of wealth. It was maximizing profits for their shareholders. Whether they played a little football or cricket with the natives whilst they were over there, that was not the motivation for the imperial project. And again, we need to look at the world economy of the moment and say, well, what happened to many of these corporations? They simply didn't disappear with formal decolonization in the middle of the 20th century. We can look at the generative roots of a company like Unilever being the Royal Niger Company. We can look at the generative roots of a company like BP, British Petroleum, being the Anglo-Iranian Oil Corporation. And so many of those corporate entities that did the extraction of wealth during the Age of Empire continue to do that and continue to drive inequality in the world even in the 21st century. So I don't think we can confront the problem of growing inequality, not just across the world, but also even now right here in the former heart of empire, Britain, without really confronting this colonial legacy.
Thank you. I like that language of confronting this colonial legacy, and that's going to now coming on to you, Kehinde. So your latest book, Nobody Can Give You Freedom, right? I think that's part of the title, the real mission of Malcolm X, yeah? And I'm linking that title and what that book is about and your work generally to this question of confronting. How do we confront these legacies today? Because it's really important that we understand it, but the key point, I think paraphrasing Karl Marx, is the point is to change it. How do we change? Once we know and we have we can see more clearly, and we can even visualize the problem, but also what then are some of the solutions. So what is it in your work you are offering as some of the ways that we can confront this world that has been created as a result of this history and its continuing impacts today?
Yeah, so I'm going to start with what not to do, because I think that's quite important as well. Kojo mentioned some of the corporations. I mean, Britain's largest corporate entity is Lloyd's of London, right? Lloyd's of London turns over 50 billion, some crazy amount of money. And I remember being watching TV years ago, and the CEO came on because they were celebrating their 350th anniversary. And she literally said, deadpan into the camera, "We are proud of our roots in ensuring the merchant trade." Totally forgot about slavery, didn't mention this at all. In fact, Lloyd's of London may be the worst company that's ever existed. Before it insured slave ships, which is where it got its money from, it was the coffee house in London where you would return runaway slaves. There probably is, like I said, no worse company. But in 2020, in all that rash of guilt, white guilt, I don't know what you want to call it, Lloyd's was one of the first companies to come out and say, "We're sorry," which was really surprising given that they've been sued, I think, at least 3 times in the American courts, and each time said nothing to do with us, don't come and do this. But Black Lives Matter came 2020, they apologized and said they're going to do reparations, right? And their reparations was giving some money to a neo-colonial development bank, giving about, I think it was like £20,000 to charity, some really small amount to local charities, and then they now have a diversity scheme for, and I'm not joking, the term they use is ethnically diverse people. That's reparations, right? I mean, and Sister Esther is one of the big reparations advocates in the UK, and I'll be honest, I'm actually quite worried because when I see reparations now, it's more reparations washing than it is actually reparations. Lloyd's, the only thing, if you're thinking what could a company like Lloyd's of London do, it is to dissolve itself and to give all of its wealth and money to the communities of which it has impacted. That's it. It's not like, we just have to be real and say there's some things which are so deeply ingrained in the histories of slavery, colonialism, et cetera, that they can no longer exist. right? But obviously, that's not what people want to do, right? Instead, people want to have diversity schemes. Edinburgh University has a £20 million commitment to giving white researchers money, apparently, is what the universities do. I mean, this is what's happening. We're actually in an age where we're going to get reparations, but it's just not going to be reparations, right? Which does lead me to one of the big problems that we have, is that, look, the reality is that if you look, just look with the word objective is the wrong word, I don't like that word, but just look at the facts. It is very, very clear that the world that we live in today is white supremacy. The poorest parts of the world, in terms of income, are where the black people live, so-called sub-Saharan Africa. The richest parts are where the white people live, and there's a hierarchy in between. It's literally white supremacy today, right? You cannot possibly explain that without all the things we talked about. It's about colonial extraction, it's about slavery, it's so obvious, yet we don't even talk about it, right? The UN, the supposedly friendly one of the international. The UN's the worst, by the way. Just like, out of all of them, IMF, World Bank, at least we know they're bad. The UN, some people still have faith in. I don't understand. But anyway, the UN doesn't actually mention racism, white supremacy, the most obvious thing to explain global inequality, right? So the question we have to ask is why is this? And this is where I get to what do we do, right? So we have to first acknowledge the scale of the problem, is that I call it a psychosis. So my last book, I just wrote a book about Malcolm X, but the one before that was called The Psychosis of Whiteness, right? And people get quite upset sometimes, but the idea of that is to say, well, actually, how can I be a professor, been through every single level of schooling in this country, and the only single time I've ever heard the word empire in a classroom is when it's come out of my mouth, right? You cannot understand Britain without empire. It's literally impossible, but we do it all the time, right? How do you explain that with anything other than the idea of psychosis? The reason that we have this completely deluded understanding of the world is because we have to have this completely deluded understanding of the world to continue what we do, right? The point of a psychosis is to convince you that you think you're well when you're not well, right? You think we're making progress when we're not making any progress. Most people in the world today live in exactly the same conditions and probably worse conditions than they did 100 years ago. The world is not moving in a progress narrative. It's actually kind of stuck in the same place and probably getting worse in many ways. In fact, so-called sub-Saharan Africa, I keep saying so-called because it's not terribly racist idea, but population is going to rise by about 3 billion in the next 100 years, and about 90% of all extreme poverty is estimated to be in Africa by the end of the century. It's not getting better, it's getting worse, yet we somehow think it's getting better. And so when you say, what do we do, it's really important that what we don't do and what won't work is if someone's in a psychosis, you don't try to use rational arguments because it's pointless, right? And believe me, having been in those debates on TV and Piers Morgan and every place, you're literally talking to yourself, right? You can give all the facts, all the evidence, you can lay it out really calmly and carefully. It doesn't matter, right? Because the psychosis is protecting the society. The truth is today, and I'm part of this, I'm one of the top earners in the entire world. I don't even earn that much. That's just because most people earn really, really, really little, right? And so if we're going to overcome this, it's not going to be through the rational argument, it's going to be through revolution, right? Like I've been saying, I just wrote a book, Malcolm X. The whole point of that Malcolm X book is you have to seize your freedom, you have to take your freedom. Nobody's going to give it to you. Know what you got? You're not going to make the argument for it. We've been on the right side of the argument for 500 years. Look where that has got us. Actually, what we need to do is building the alternatives. And for me, the reparations argument has always been an argument to say, this system owes us so much, it's never going to give it to us. So what do we have to do? We have to go and take it, right? So maybe we should have, I don't know if it's the right joke to make, but I was saying maybe we should have took some hostages today. Maybe that would have been the way, maybe that would have been the way forward. But I am joking, I did not come to kidnap anybody.
Who shall we start with? Okay. Okay.
It's Q&A, haven't it?
I think, okay, let's go back to the script.
I am joking, buddy.
You wasn't expecting that, was you? So I want us to explore a bit more around, okay, we've heard about what's happened, the consequences, what not to do, but what can we do? And we've ended up in a nice place for me, that I like to explore around reparations, repair. But I'm also going to link the revolution to it, which you don't often hear reparations and revolution together. And a lot of what's happening is actually quite reformist. I would say elite capture, movement capture, and state capture of reparations agendas. But I want us to unpick then, what does repair look like? Because it is about reimagining, yeah? So we know what the problem is, we've been exploring that, but what visions do all of you have for that transformation? Yeah? And that's an open question. You can go with where you want with it, but I particularly want us to anchor in reparations or repair, the root of repair, which obviously means many different things to different people. But that's what I want us to focus on. What does a repaired economy look like? What does a repaired society in the Caribbean and beyond? And those of us who are connected, we're all on this stage part of diasporas. Yeah? So let's explore what is that reparative response that you're part of shaping or that you believe should happen. Any one of you can start?
I can start. So I think I probably want to draw on three themes: acknowledgement, self-determination, and structural transformation. So on acknowledgement, I think Kehinde was already talking about this, the kind of acknowledging the scale of the problem or the scale of the history. So I'm kind of coming here today partly wearing my Commonwealth researcher hat, this non-fiction work that I've done. I'm also an author of fiction, and I write about the Caribbean in the aftermath of slavery. And one of the reasons for doing that is that when I was doing this work on the history of slavery, the legacy of slavery, I really came up against, I call it the memory gap, the sense that there is just this massive difference between the way that slavery is remembered here in terms of William Wilberforce and the Royal Navy suppressed the slave trade. What they don't tell you is when the Royal Navy captured those slave ships, the people on board would be either forcibly enlisted into the British Armed Forces, or they'd be sent to places like Trinidad and Guyana to work as indentured labourers. But anyway, that's the way that it's remembered here in this country, but then it's so different to how it's remembered in the Caribbean. And, you know, my grandparents were part of the Windrush generation, that sense of when they came to England, they knew everything about this country, but people had not even heard of the islands that they came from. And so that level of disrespect, where the history is just not known, it's not understood, it's not acknowledged. So I think part of the solution, or the kind of first step, is that acknowledgement, that getting people on the same page about how things are remembered. On self-determination, I think that, Esther, obviously this is a huge part of the movement work that you do, but really emphasising that affected communities have to lead the way here. And I think we've already touched on some of the ways in which there can be kind of reparations without repair, big institutions saying, well, we're going to give an apology without any consultation with affected communities, we're going to give some money without really addressing what these communities want. And I think you even saw in the kind of the Dutch case, there was even a governmental apology for and governmental reparations for transatlantic enslavement, something you'd think that the movement would want, but there was kind of uproar in the Caribbean that this had been done unilaterally. And I guess thinking about the theme of this conference and some of the people in this room, I think that starting from that listening mode and that sense of you have to engage with the people that this really touches is really crucial. And I think it also speaks to the idea that you're genuinely transforming the relationships here. And I would say that this is a learning journey I was on in a way, because I, as a graduate student, did this work on reparations, and I kind of felt like I had a real handle on it here in the UK, and then I traveled to the Caribbean to interview people, and I think I was expecting to find a movement that was very oriented around the relationship with the UK, like what does the UK need to do, how does the UK need to apologise, what money does the UK need to give. And so many people were focused on more self-repair, these kind of things of how can we as a community reconnect with our heritage, how can we unlearn elements of white supremacy, white supremacist beauty standards that damage us, how can we build links with West Africa to do cultural exchange. And all of those things need resources, so I still think there's absolutely a role for wealth holders or wealthier countries in the world to be financing those initiatives, but the point is they really come out of trying to step out of that relationship of we're not begging money from the UK, we're not begging an apology from the UK, because we no longer want our self-determination, our kind of self-actualization to be completely dependent on what the UK does or what white people do. So I think that self-determination side is really critical. And then finally, on structural transformation, I guess that we've spoken about one of the reasons I think the vision of, say, the UK government in a few years' time says we're going to give £100 million to some kind of, foundation in the Caribbean, and that's reparations. Well, okay, but the Caribbean will continue to be responsible for 0.3% of historic global CO2 emissions, and yet the second most hazard-prone region in the world. That money is not going to transform that structural relation with climate change. Barbados will still have the third highest per capita GDP to debt ratio in the world. Again, that's not going to transform that. So I think once we understand that it's not about kind of transferring money to atone for something that happened a long time ago, but it's about these ongoing systems of extraction, you have to look much more structurally, and I guess in a more revolutionary sense, and a sense of reimagining the economic systems and really transforming the way that they operate. And I think I'll end there, because I think that I don't necessarily have all or any of the answers of what that reimagining looks like, and that's where I think the kind of the self-determination and the more kind of participatory way of reimagining these systems comes into play. But acknowledgement, self-determination, structural transformation.
Thank you. Over to you, Kojo.
Absolutely, yeah. I would just continue on with that vision of structural transformation, because I think with the kind of myopia and suppression around histories of empire, we ignore the extent to which so many of those systems of empire continue to be maintained even up until today. And so within that system, a transfer of simple monetary value could end up in a situation where, like Eleanor mentioned, £100 million is sent to the Caribbean, but because you maintain those systems of wealth extraction, another 5 years after that, that £100 million is back in a bank account in the city of London, and everyone in the British government is saying, well, we gave you the money, well, these people can't help themselves, what can we do? That ignores the fact that when we look at, say, the relationship with ostensibly even independent Caribbean countries like Jamaica, the highest court in Jamaica continues to be the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. This is one of the most shadowy entities in the British Constitution that I would argue 95% of British people wouldn't even know they exist. But that's still your final opportunity for any justice in Jamaica. If you go up between the courts and the courts and the courts, you end up in front of the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. We know that the Jamaican Armed Forces still continues to swear allegiance to the British Crown. We know that we look at, some of the leading offshore financial centers in the world that just happen to be coincidentally either current or former British overseas territories. That isn't a coincidence. That is a result of the kind of haphazard way that the British Empire organized its juridical relationships between crown colonies, protectorates, dominions, all to facilitate the movement and extraction of wealth on all those different levels. And when we talk about, when we get the Panama Papers or the Paradise Papers leak and we find out how much money's being squirreled away offshore, there's usually this response in the British media and even the British government of like, this is terrible, but what can we do, they've taken the money to the Cayman Islands, the BVI, Bermuda, these distant, tropical, bizarre Caribbean paradises. There's nothing anyone can do, unless James Bond is going to go in and get the money back. We've just got to wash our hands of this. Completely erasing the fact that the Cayman Islands, the BVI, and Bermuda are still British territories. These are not even independent countries. Ultimate sovereignty remains right down the road in Westminster. And if we wanted to do structural transformation around access to, finding out who has beneficial interests in these assets that are registered over there, and reducing the ability for financial advisors in London to be able to funnel money to these offshore financial centers that are then used to anonymously buy property here in London. If we wanted to deal with all of that, the British government could do that tomorrow. I mean, if you want an example of how the British government can do structural transformation in its overseas territories, You just need to ask the people of the Chagos Islands. You know, they were able to expel an entire population from one of its overseas territories, but in its other overseas territories, they're like, well, we can't tell you the kind of assets that are squirreled away here. It's all too complex and complicated. It's beyond anybody's ability. And so structural transformation is possible, it's necessary, and I think that that needs to be the precursor before any kind of reparative justice initiatives. Otherwise, like Eleanor mentioned, you'll maintain the systems of inequality whilst allowing the presentation of having actually performed justice when you haven't.
Okay, so structural transformation, if you like, as a precursor to reparations. I want to explore that, but Kehinde, coming back to you, you began us off on this revolutionary tip. Can I drill down a bit more for you in terms of reimagining and what a revolutionary approach to reparations, taking on board the structural transformation arguments and the necessity for communities to assert their self-determination as part of the process to wherever we're going to? Can we explore that a bit more?
Yeah, so I mean, I think when we say revolution, it typically you think about guns and violence, etc. But that's not really what revolution is. I just wrote a book about Malcolm X. Malcolm, for me, is the most important intellectual of the 20th century on these issues. And you know, on reparations, there's two things Malcolm says. One of them is if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, that's not progress. Even if you pull it all the way out, that's still not progress. You actually have to heal the wound, right? So the question is, what is healing the wound? And for radicals, healing the wound has always been actually independence. Like the problem is that the independence is a joke. Jamaica's not independent, Nigeria's not independent, India's not really independent. The idea these places are independent is a complete myth, right? And actually, if we actually had financial economic independence, that's what freedom looks like. So you do need complete structural change. So the way that Malcolm actually, in the Nation of Islam, is a bit problematic in many ways, but there's a model of reparations where he says, look, give us everything we need for 25 years. He says, look, just give us some land, give us everything. America should just give black people everything we need for 25 years, let us set up our own economy, and then leave us the hell alone, right? And that doesn't really work in America for lots of reasons, but that principle of actually, if we're gonna have, we need to have wealth transfer. We are owed a debt, a massive, huge debt. Money should be involved, and not millions, we're talking trillions, right? But the question is, what do you do with that money? So what you don't do is give it individuals. I don't want the money, it's completely pointless. What we do is, what we should be doing is say, well, actually, how do we invest in the structural changes that we need? So why is it that countries after so-called independence fall into debt? It's because they're underdeveloped. Don't have factories, don't have roads, don't have the ways to produce economies, etc. For Malcolm, the big revolution was always the African revolution. Africa is the place that has, well, for the time being, has everything you could possibly need, farmland, resources, etc., etc., etc. Should be the richest part of the world by a distance, but isn't because it's deeply underdeveloped. All of the wealth is extracted out. So if we were saying, look, blue sky utopian thinking, what should you use reparations money for? Well, actually, let's use the money to develop on the African continent so that it can actually produce for itself. And once you have an independent Africa, well, capitalism basically ends tomorrow, the day after that, and then it allows you to build something different. But this is how we should be thinking about reparations. Also, like I said, if you actually understand the reparations, if that's the end point of our reparations, that is the end point of the West. So we have to accept that that's never going to happen, right? The West can't give us reparations that ends the West, because well, why would that ever happen? So then if that's the vision that we're going for, then the question is, how are we building towards that? Maybe taking some of this money, maybe doing some of these things, but actually how do you can't bite the hand that feeds you in a way, and true reparations ends everything that we currently have, right? It creates a new system. That's what revolutions are about.
Okay, so just exploring that a bit further, because again, thinking about reparations and in the context of today and the need to reimagine, I think we need to reimagine what this term means, because there is always this reduction to money, but we know wealth is not money. You know, money is a small part of what true wealth is. And I think we need to, you know, decolonize our understandings of what wealth are and how it is transferred intergenerationally and who has it and how do we acquire it. But part of that reimagining is also the structures, but the people's role in it, because Even if we talk about money, I'm sure there are people in this room, wealth holders, wealth advisors, who want to know, what can we do? What can we do? What should we be advising our clients who are socially conscious, environmentally aware, who do want to be part of the change? But what does that look like? And I think it's important for us to give some clarity over that. But I also feel we need to think about who is doing this reimagining? Who is it for? You know, what is the role of states? Is it just saying, well, we need wealth redistribution to a region? But given what's already been said about how the whole sort of global financial system works, any resources that go one way are going to end up back here. So we need to fundamentally transform and reimagine even what we see that region, the Caribbean, and our connection to it to be. We need to reimagine governance. We need to reimagine possibilities for how we are going to work together and reorganize the resources of our home, our earth home, which is what economy, the root of economy is. It is about how we reorder, reconnect, redistribute, and caretake and steward the resources of our common home. So just moving us on, let's, in the last few minutes that we have, if there's any guidance, concrete guidance that you can give to those in the room, wealth holders, wealth advisors, those who want to know, what should we be doing? Philanthropic organizations, what should and can we be doing?
Yeah, I think I'll come back to that point I made earlier about being so struck by the movements in the Caribbean for self-repair. And that's not just true in the Caribbean, it's true of grassroots activists here in the UK, across Europe. I think trying to go to find where those people are that are doing that work of reimagining and ask them, how can I help you? I think it's, you know, I certainly don't feel like it's my place on this stage to give you the step-by-step guide, because it's those people's places. And so, as I said earlier, I think they need resources, they need financing for these projects to succeed. And so it's about trying to find where people are already doing the work and ask them, how can I support you? I think that's going to be really crucial for putting that kind of agency and self-determination of affected communities at the center of what's happening, and making sure that you're not replicating old structures of kind of supplicant and wealth holder, but actually creating spaces where people can come together as equals and share ideas and properly collaborate to build this new future.
Thank you. Okay, Kojo.
Absolutely. I think that this idea of having to reshape the world also reminds us just what a fundamental reshaping of the world colonial capitalism actually was. And if we think about what we want to do, I think we need to think about the same way that colonial capitalism took many of the vehicles and structures that preceded it and weaponized it for this extractive vision of human experience, to think about how we can use those tools for a different vision of human experience. And I'll make this, very concrete. I spoke a little bit earlier about, this kind of conveyor belt of companies that did so much of the heavy profiteering and extraction of empire, Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, Levant Company, Muscovy Company, etc. So it's almost unimaginable for us to think in the 21st century, but the corporate form, the corporation, wasn't commercial prior to the colonial endeavor. The corporate body was the vehicle that we would use to shepherd projects over generations to ensure people's responsible commitment towards shepherding this project over generations, and will be applied to things like churches, like universities. This was the idea of the corporate form before the joint stock corporation emerged through the English, the Dutch empires, all those companies that I mentioned. And the idea of the corporation now is very much crystallized in our mind as only being motivated by maximum profits for its shareholders at all times, to any expense, even to the expense of the destruction of the corporation itself. So many companies are rather like, we'd rather fire everyone and go out of business than our shareholders take even a little bit less money than they took last year. That transformation of the corporate form, I think, could also be transformed in the future. We could have public interest companies that have a same locked-in commitment to a particular idea of a stewardship of the world over the next generations, with the same commitment that we currently have to the maximization of revenue for shareholders. We could look at instruments like the trust, which I'm sure many wealth advisors and wealth holders here will be very familiar with, in order to separate out the kind of registered ownership from the beneficiary. This could be a vehicle that again could be used for things like reparative justice, to facilitate ways of kind of funneling resources to a broader vision of who counts as a beneficiary, in the way that we talk about, ensuring that finances could go to people in the Caribbean who are the front line of issues like the climate crisis, the migration crisis, and many of the problems of the 21st century. I think this isn't going to be a kind of comprehensive plan for what we can do in the future, and there'll be stuff and insights that many other people will share in this room that I will not be aware of. But I think one of the first things we can do is looking at what is it that we do and why do we do it. And if we are setting up companies or setting up trusts or setting up these instruments in order for our own private accumulation of wealth and hoarding of wealth, and leading to a world in which it's requiring more and more violence to maintain this system. We're seeing increasing inequality, not just now in the Caribbean, in Africa, in the Indian subcontinent, but even here in England, even in North America. It feels like this wealth inequality is becoming unsustainable. And what's the alternative future? Private, gated communities with armed security guards on the door, in order to try and ensure that we get a little bit more revenue than we got the year before? Or could we use some of those vehicles to try and create a different type of world, one in which we might all be able to flourish and not have to live with the constant anxiety and fear that we discussed in the first presentation of this entire conference? And so that's what I would say are some ideas for what we could do in the future.
Thank you. And over to you, Kehinde.
All right, so honestly, I write about revolution, black politics, and don't really think about the top down, think about the bottom up. So if you want to, I can give you a whole blueprint for black revolution, but not for this audience. So, but I am going to try and be positive, because look, you don't have to be here. If you're like a very wealthy sitting in this audience being told your money's racist, you don't have to be here. That's a thing, right? That's a choice. And importantly, that's a very important first choice, because I'm guessing most rich people don't want to hear that, right? And so it does remind me, actually, Malcolm, when he's always Malcolm makes books, everything's Malcolm, starts the organization Afro-American Unity, and he says just for black people. Only black people can join, but we can have a white Friends of the OAAU if you want. It's not like you can't understand the arguments. And I think that understanding is a really, really, really important place to be. Right? And even for me, I don't have lots of wealth, but I have more wealth than most people. Everybody in this room has more wealth than most people. And I think it's really important to understand how that wealth is produced. A child dies every 10 seconds because they haven't got access to food and water. That is because of the wealth that we have. So we've been sitting here, there's literally just dead children, black and brown children just died because of our wealth. Now I say that because you should feel bad, right? And this is when we think about philanthropy and what you can do with your money, the biggest problem with philanthropy is it makes you feel better. And it shouldn't, right? It shouldn't. You shouldn't feel better. You shouldn't feel better. We understand what's happening in the world. We should feel bad. And that's the place to be, because that guilt, that feeling of what the hell's going on, that feeling of this is awful, should be the thing that motivates you. But too often philanthropy is, I do this, I've done my part, I feel better. That's the worst possible way. Because remember, the wealth is produced through dead children. Let's just put it that way. I don't mean to be I said I was going to be positive. I promise I'll be positive. Sounds very negative, but I'm going to get there. All right. So the thing is, we are where we are, right? To some extent, you are where you are. I didn't choose to be born here. I didn't choose to have this. You are where you are. So the question is, what do we do once we understand what the system is? And so it is giving money. There's many organizations out there doing really, really important work that need funding. Right? And it is thinking about if I'm gonna invest lots of money, what am I gonna invest it in? Don't invest it in those things which are surface. Invest it in those things which are, let's build factories, let's build infrastructure, this is how we think about reparations, is building the infrastructure so countries don't need your support, right? You don't, the idea that we send food is completely wrong. We should send the equipment so that people can get their own food, right? Rethink how we're giving money, that's what true reparations can look like. So like I said, I'll be honest, I'm not that optimistic. I believe in revolution from below, but I will always there always has to be scope to say, well, actually, yeah, the people with the money, the people with the resources, well, Malcolm called it the ballot or the bullet, right? You have the choice, and this does go back to what Kojo was saying. Like, realistically, the majority of the world lives in horrendous conditions, the majority of the world. And at some point, it is the ballot or the bullet. Like, it can't go on forever, right? It ends with the ballot being give people access, give people what they need, let go of the reins, or the whole thing burns down. That's just a reality. And maybe faced with that, people will start to think, well, actually, how can we genuinely start to put the resources where they are necessary and where they are needed?
Okay, well, I think we need to wrap up now because of time. I know we're going into the break time, but I feel that we need to fundamentally reimagine the frameworks around repair that we're hearing, because we hear that reparations has happened, but it's bad. To me, that's not reparations. And we need to be conscious of the way in which this language has become a metaphor for everything. You know, that famous paper around decolonization becoming a metaphor for equal opportunities and diversity schemes. That's what's happening with reparations. But reparations is revolutionary because it is about fundamental transformation and restructuring of the world. But we do that people to people, community to community, bit by bit. So it is about people, but it is about people and how we relate to our planet, to our Mother Earth together. And that's what needs to change in terms of our conceptualizations of the harm, but also what we do to address it. So with that being said, I want to thank Eleanor, Kojo, and Kehinde for stimulating us today, for the humor, and for taking us through a very, very important discussion. Thank you. Okay, cool. Put it on.
Okay, we're now going to go to a half-an-hour break. So follow I think one of these, and these doors will take you to the refreshment room. See you in half an hour at 12. That was